I'm Nadya Swart, and it's really incredible to finally be speaking to Dr. Robin Stern. We'll be chatting about gaslighting. She's a world-leading authority. She's a psychoanalyst at Yale and the founder and associate director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, but she's also the author of the 2007 book called The Gaslight Effect, which has been credited with actually popularizing the term gaslighting. So Dr. Stern, it's taken a few sessions for us to finally actually get to the interview, but thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and having gotten to know you over these many weeks where we were trying to get an interview and that couldn't happen, I just am really overjoyed to be here. Just for the sake of accuracy, I switched roles at the center, and I was the associate director for many years, and I still am, of course, the co-founder, but now I'm the senior advisor to the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and very happy in my new role. And of course, still working on gaslighting and have my own podcast on the gaslight effect.
I saw that. There's so many things that I want to get to, and we will.
And we will.
As we've just discussed, it might be sort of an ongoing thing, because I think a topic like this, it's become sort of a buzzword, and that's what I want to ask you to clarify, because with things like these, when they become buzzwords, we really lose the meaning of gaslighting. So if you can clarify, what is gaslighting?
Gaslighting is the process where within a dynamic where one person has power or more power than the other, that person who has the power seeks to sow seeds of doubt in the mind of the person who has less power, and ultimately lead them. Person in power leads the person with less power to question their judgment, their character, and in more extreme cases, their sanity. So it's that kind of psychological abuse, psychological manipulation that causes someone to question their own reality. And what's interesting and important about gaslighting, and makes it different than a moment where somebody is trying to gaslight you, the gaslighting in a relationship is repeated over time. So in a first instance, somebody may say something to you like, you know what, you're really not very good at remembering things that I tell you. And you may say, that's so ridiculous. Of course I remember things. But then when that person keeps telling you over and over again and pointing to ways in which you don't remember that they may have even made up, it's really hard not to stop and think, gee, maybe they're right. And I would add, especially for women who have been socialized to be pleasers, who have been socialized to be empathic, and being empathic is a wonderful thing, except when you get stuck in the other person's shoes. So the reason I coined the gaslight effect was that I was seeing people in my practice who were not the same strong people they were when they started their relationships. They were not able to make decisions. They were feeling confused and crazy at work, at home, and just in general. They were feeling less than they wanted to feel about themselves in terms of their self-esteem. And that impact hadn't been explored. So that there's gaslighting, which is the dynamic we're talking about, where one person's undermining the other person's reality, and then the gaslight effect, which is what happens to that person as a result of the ongoing gaslighting.
Let's just get straight into it, because as with things that become so popular, I mean, it's like mental illnesses lately. Everyone just has everything. But examples. What are examples of gaslighting? And let's take it through the different kinds of, relationships and dynamics. Let's start with, because I know that it's a big thing in the workplace.
Yes.
Gaslighting in the workplace.
I have a whole chapter on that in my book. this in the new book, The Recovery Guide, which was just written last year. And it is, for example, you go into your boss and you say, or your supervisor, you say, I'm noticing that I haven't been invited to the meetings that I used to be invited to. Something going on that I'm left off the email chain, or did something change within the organization that I need to know about, or are you unhappy with my work? And just, can we talk about it? And your boss or supervisor looks at you and says, no, everything's fine. You're very stressed. You look stressed. Maybe you need a day or two off. And maybe you are stressed, but that still doesn't address the fact that you're not on the email chain, that you're not being invited to the meeting, that you are not in the conversations you used to be in. And that is actually a true story. Somebody I know, friend of mine, not even a patient, and a friend of mine. And she ended up leaving her job because of the gaslighting over time, feeling more and more stressed that there was a discrepancy between the reality she was living and what she was hearing each and every time she went to ask about it. Other examples, you're in a meeting and not the first time or the second time, but the third time, somebody's taking credit for your work. And you confront that person maybe after the meeting. You don't want to make a lot of noise in the meeting. Maybe you're afraid. And you're told, it's not true. It wasn't your idea. It was my idea. What are you thinking about? Don't you remember it correctly? And so you begin to think back and you think, no, it was my idea. But over time, as the other person may insist, that was my idea. Maybe you're getting angry, rightly so, and maybe you're not getting angry, and instead you're pointing the finger at yourself and saying, maybe they're right. Maybe I don't remember correctly. Or you have a discrepancy with somebody about the deadline, something that's due, and you know that you made the commitment together. You know that you made this agreement. But that person keeps telling you that isn't the way it was. Those are not the things we agreed to. And you end up second-guessing yourself. What's important about all the examples and gaslighting in general is that people can try to gaslight you. And if you don't step into it, which doesn't mean it's your fault, but if you don't step into it, it does not become that kind of destructive pattern. So, for example, when somebody says, well, you don't remember that correctly, you can say, to step away from the gaslighting dynamic, I do remember it correctly. I know you see it differently. That's not how it happened.
Which has got to be really difficult in a, relationship with the superior. Which is quite sad because I would imagine that that's sort of something that bosses, rely on.
Yes.
Taken on.
And the other really important thing that has happened in the workplace and was certainly part of the Me Too movement was or is when somebody crosses boundaries and then somebody tells you it's not a big deal. Come on, honey, it's not a big deal. Or, I don't know what you're talking about. That never happened. You're making it up. You wanted that from me, but it's not what happened. And through the years of working with women in the Woodhull Institute for Ethical Leadership, that was an organization I was part of for many years, we saw and heard a lot of people, young women in particular, coming in talking about how they did feel like the things they were experiencing with men, particularly, or other women, that felt just that side of inappropriate were no big deal. And that maybe if they were a little bit stronger, maybe if they were a little less sensitive, those things wouldn't have bothered them. And so when the Me Too movement became so popular, to me, it was about women reclaiming their reality and having the validation from so many others and from the world in general at that point to say, this is a big deal. And you don't have to step into that dynamic and second guess yourself all the time.
This is such a sad thing to, find myself saying, but I feel like those are the, lucky situations where it is, overt enough for you to recognize that, because gaslighting does, from what I've researched, appear to be so subtle very often that if you had to relay the situation to someone else without a full context, you'd be too embarrassed to even do that because it doesn't make sense. It's sort of,
And one of the things that I have said often is that when women come into my office and they or go to another therapist's office or seek guidance, and they have black and blue marks, or they can say, my partner screamed at me, or they cursed at me. It's easy to say that happened and he or they did it. But as you're saying, when it is more subtle and when you just don't feel like what's going on is okay, we too often point the finger at ourselves and we say, there's something wrong with me. Like, why am I not more accommodating? So one of the things that sets us up for gaslighting all too well is when we like to be accommodating. And in a relationship, it's a good thing to be accommodating. But when you're accommodating to the point where you're beginning to lose yourself, or everything is about what your partner or your friend or your boss wants, to the detriment of the way you are living on a daily basis, where you can't even care for yourself because you can't get sleep, because you can't nourish yourself because of the anxiety in the relationship. At that point, then accommodating becomes pathological for you, right? And yet the on-ramp to that can feel very subtle. You're just giving up a little piece, a memory here, a reality there.
Not to the, sort of harder, more complex relationships, because I think that the closer you are with someone, the more insidious it might become. So gaslighting in a relationship, let's go with a romantic relationship. What does that sound like? What does it look like?
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you, because that has been really the lane that I have walked in and been in for so long. And people who read my book, people who came to see me, were predominantly women talking about their gaslighter partners who are men, although gaslighting can happen in any relationship. And as you rightly pointed out and we spoke about, in the workplace, and can happen in the workplace, not just between two people, but in the workplace at large, where you're kind of living in this gaslight bubble and you know it, but you don't know it because you're second guessing yourself. But back to relationships, I'll give you a really strong example, powerful example. A woman came to me and told me that she and her partner had resolved something that was going on between them for a very long time, and things seemed to be working and they were fighting less, but somehow it didn't feel right to her. And what they did, and I may have told you this story when we were interviewing to be interviewed, but it is that the couple would go out together in her neighborhood. They'd walk down the street together. She was very friendly, and people would greet her, and because they knew her, and she would respond and have an interaction with them. And her partner was not happy about that, because he was jealous and he was possessive and he wanted all of her attention. And so he would get angry and they would fight, and he would tell her that she was flirting and she was mistreating him and neglecting him. And they would argue about that. And it would be very difficult. And one day he said, well, I have a solution. I think that when we're walking down the street, if you look down at the sidewalk, rather than keeping your head up straight as we're walking, then we won't be fighting anymore because you won't be tempted to be flirting. I won't be upset with you because I'll have your attention, and that'll be great. So at the point that she came to see me, she had been doing that for a while, and she agreed, in fact, that he was right because it stopped the fighting, right? And, giving up that little piece of herself, that reality. And what happened over time was that he began to say to her, and this is, sorry to repeat myself, but this is when she came to see me. When they went into the restaurant, he said, I want you to start to take the seat that faces the wall, because if you're facing the wall, then nobody can greet you and you won't be flirting with anyone and we won't have a bad night. And so she, sitting in my office, said to me, I feel like there's something wrong with that, but I can't find anything wrong with that because, in fact, it stopped the fighting. So maybe there's something wrong with me. So that's an extreme example. I mean, of course, the end of that story is that they did not stay together, but it took a very long time, as it always does, for her to be able to say, this just doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't even matter that the fighting stopped. I'm feeling controlled. I'm giving up pieces of myself. I'm accepting his reality that the reason that things are okay is because I'm staring at the wall.
In situations like these, does the gaslighter, do they know that they're in circumstances where they say hurtful things, where they make the other person question their own sanity, or cling on to the hope that their partner is right, that they are wrong, because the alternative is just quite, do the gaslighters know that they're hurting their partners? Do they intend to? Or do they believe what they're saying?
Great question. And it gives me the segue to say that people are not born gaslighting. Not every gaslighter is as malevolent as the character in the Gaslight movie, which I can say in a minute. But gaslighting is a learned, socially constructed, and it's a behavior. Social learning, you either learn it because you saw it happening, you had it happening to you, you experienced it on one side, and it was effective, or you happen into it. So actually happening into it happens very often. Somebody says, I wasn't able to reach you. Like, what's going on? I couldn't reach you for the last 2 nights. And, we're dating. Like, it's a little weird. Were you seeing somebody else? Rather than the person taking responsibility for either not feeling like picking up the phone or being out with somebody else or just not wanting to have that intimate a relationship, rather than saying, you know what? I don't like to talk to people I'm dating every night, or I'm just not that kind of guy, or I was busy, Instead, that person often says, why are you so paranoid? Right? Completely deflecting the conversation or shifting the conversation to something about you who asked the question, rather than me who did the action I don't want to take responsibility for. Right? Like, why didn't you call me? There you go again, being paranoid. No, I'm not really paranoid, but last time you said the same thing. You couldn't reach me. Like, so what's the big deal if I couldn't reach you? So the conversation never actually happens. The connection never really happens, right? there's no resolve unless your gaslighter is willing to say, wait a minute, you're right. My phone was off, or I didn't want to answer the phone, or I don't like to do that, or I'm sorry, but I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to tell you where I was, or I was nowhere. So is the gaslighter trying to hurt the gaslightee? Maybe not. Maybe just trying to avoid the confrontation. I mean, not trying, avoiding the confrontation, deflecting the responsibility, not wanting to tell the truth.
Well, in relationships, most of the time, the gaslighting isn't there in the very beginning. I mean, like most things, we sort of want to be the best for ourselves. So, jealousy or those things, if you are a jealous person, you generally won't show in the beginning. So, for someone who's been with someone for a few months, it must be quite a, mind-bending, depending on the degree of the gaslighting, for their partner to suddenly, display these, I don't know, it's not behaviors, but I suppose it is a behavior, but asking all these types of questions, is it maybe that they're so sort of trying to still figure it out in their own minds that they don't immediately ask what's going on? Or, how does it become entrenched in the relationship to the point where from there it can get
Great.
aggressive, abusive?
Yeah. So
Very
you're on a third date with somebody, and you say, you're late. Like, I've been waiting for a half hour. Is everything okay? I'm not late. We agreed on meeting at 8:30. No, we agreed on meeting at 8. Don't you remember? We agreed on 8:30. And in that moment, you're thinking to yourself, just going to let it go. Like, no, I know we agreed on 8:30, but I'm not going to argue with you about it. You say to yourself, mental note, it's weird. He's really insisting. Not that comfortable with that, but okay. So it's not, so often in that moment, it's not a big deal to you because you're looking at larger frame. I'm attracted to him. We had a great time when we went out last time. He's really smart, really interesting, loves to travel. Maybe this is like my guy. Like, I really felt connected to him, really felt connected. And so you're looking at all the other places in the relationship, the larger picture, and you're ignoring that one piece. And then over time, what happens, just like when you boil a lobster, it turns red over time. Like, every time there's that gaslighting moment where you're saying, that's weird. No. Maybe it's not weird. Maybe it's just me. I'll give you my own example from my own life. Many years ago, I was married to someone else, not my wonderful husband now, but somebody who actually I had 2 wonderful children with. But he was someone who was a gaslighter. He was what I call a good guy gaslighter. Really lovely to be with, great personality, very pleasant, but very sure of himself.
No one would suspect it.
No one would suspect it. If he were right here, he would be so pleasant, you'd never think that he was a manipulator. But he was somebody who was always late. And at some point when I said, it's annoying. Like, I'm setting the dinner table, waiting for you. It's really disrespectful. Can you really stop? Work on it. His response to me was, there's something wrong with the way you see time. Like, your parents must have made it a very big deal for you that people be on time. That's wrong. No one else I know in my life would care if I'm a little bit late. And so when you want to criticize me about being on time, just think about how anal you are being right now. Right. And initially I thought and said, no, completely wrong. It is respectful to be on time. This is the way the world works. People have agreements about things, and we did have an agreement about time. And but over time, when he'd be late and I would complain and he would tell me there was something wrong with me, I began to think, even though I was writing about gaslighting at the time, even though I knew it was gaslighting, I still began to think, maybe he's right. Maybe some other women wouldn't feel like it was disrespectful. Like, what's going on with me? And I want to just take a moment to say that there isn't anything wrong with initially turning your attention to yourself and saying, is this me? But when you say to yourself, this is not me, it's really important to try to get rid of all those other voices that start to say, but maybe, but maybe, but maybe. And one of the ways that can be very helpful is something you talked about just a few minutes ago when before we started recording, writing it down. Like, write it down. This is the way I know the reality is for me, and really stand firm in that. Ask people who know you, people whose opinion you trust outside the relationship, which in a gaslighting relationship can become harder over time.